Hello and welcome to Material Girls, a pop culture podcast that uses critical theory to understand the zeitgeist. I'm Marcelle Cosman.
And I'm Hannah McGregor. And we have another rad as hell guest. Karrmen Crey, pronouns she, her, is Stalo and a member of the Chiam First Nation. She is an associate professor in the School of Communication at Simon Fraser University, where her research examines the rise of Indigenous media in Canada in the institutions of media culture that Indigenous media practitioners have historically engaged and navigated to produce their own works. She is also the author of Producing Sovereignty, The Rise of Indigenous Media in Canada, available now. Welcome, Karrmen.
Thank you for having me.
Welcome, Karrmen. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for being the reason I have now, in the past one day, watched 8 solid hours of Reservation Dogs. Man, this show rules, huh?
I think, Karrmen, it's important that you know that I have told Hannah to watch the show before.
So many people have told me to watch it. I don't do what I'm told.
I am glad to hear that it has that kind of word of mouth recognition, because that's how you know you've made it, is when people are like, have you watched? And it's happening by text or word of mouth.
Yep. Much to the chagrin of marketers everywhere. Unfortunately, word of mouth is still the number one most effective way for people to find out about things. But not for me, because word of mouth didn't work. I had to be assigned it by you, my professor.
Well, and I'm always happy to apply a similar pressure and guilt that I do to my students, to my friends, colleagues. I'm very happy and very proud to do it.
I told Hannah via text that my goal for this episode is that every single listener will now, having listened to this episode, go and watch the show. So maybe for our opening chat, we could just talk about some random things that we love about the show, just to give the listeners a little soupçon.
Yeah, a favorite episode, a favorite character, a favorite moment. Karrmen, do you want to go first?
I mean, I will also say that I did a lot of rewatching leading up to our conversation today. But I think the one that has lasted the test of time, like in my kind of goldfish brain, summer brain right now, has always got to be decolonization. The episode where they have the decolonization workshop.
Oh my God, yeah.
That, I have to say, as far as Native friends and family, that episode, just cut across. Everybody had the same, talking points. We've all been there. In whatever capacity your job is, if you work in an office, a bureaucracy, an institution, and they have EDI, equity, diversity, inclusion training, you have been to this workshop. And it was so funny. I can't get I'm a young elder out of my head. One guy, facilitator calling himself a young elder, I just about died because I know that person. I've been in that workshop.
It's such a good episode. It's the acronym is NARDS.
NARDS.
It's a Native youth event that they put on every year. And they've brought in these internet influencers to talk about and do activities around decolonization. And they nail the making fun of these figures while also being totally not cruel to them, which I think is so characteristic of the humor in this show, that it's absolutely biting and absolutely never punching down. There's a moment where the woman of the influencers,
Miss
Matriarch, who's doing her PhD at Dartmouth, is doing a territorial acknowledgement. And she keeps going further and further back in time. And at one point she says, dinosaurs ayote.
The dinosaur nation, thanking the Neanderthal nation, also the dinosaur nation.
Also the dinosaur nation. I was laughing so hard that I had to pause because I was missing it. Oh, yeah, an absolutely incredible episode. Marcelle, do you have an episode, a memory, a character? who's stuck with you?
So many. But I think the moment I was looking forward to the most when I was rewatching while I was very sick recently is the scene when all the aunties are at the conference and they accidentally take way too many milligrams of weed. They take like 25 milligrams instead of 5 and are dancing to Brandy's Up in My Room. I can't remember exactly what the name of the song is called. And it does that sort of move back and forth between how they feel, what they imagine they look like versus what they actually look like. And that's probably one of my biggest laugh out loud moments because I've 100% been that person who's like, I could be on stage right now. And what I actually look like is very, very, very stoned.
I think the like resonance, like people also know like those aunties, like who are gonna like get up to no good sort of thing, like cutting up, like cutting loose. Like that again was, I can't say we have like 100% like immediately in my family seen that, but that is like across the board, like Native people at conferences are going to like bring the house down. And that was so consistent. And yeah, I agree. That was my second choice thing that I was going to bring up was like aunties at conference.
I love the aunties at the conference. The flip side of this show for me is like, it's made me laugh out loud by myself harder than anything I've watched in ages. And also I watched all of season 1 and 8 of the 10 episodes of season 2 yesterday. So I'm like, inside it. It also made me cry more than maybe any show I've ever watched before. And there is a scene where, I want to say this without spoiling too much, but there's a scene where one of our sort of 4 young protagonists has just lost a family member. And she runs outside to get some space for herself and encounters the spirit of that family member who thanks her for like what a good job she did that day, making sure that like community was there and ceremony was being done. And there's something about that moment that like her being thanked for like doing what this beloved family member needed that just made me sob. Like, So is this a good advertisement for this show? It's so funny and it made me cry so much.
You know what, Hannah? I think that is a great advertisement for the show because we're not the only people who are laughing and crying to it. And I think we could talk about more in the next segment.
Oh, let's do it. Our first segment, as always, is Why This, Why Now? Wherein we ask the materialist question, what are or were the historical, ideological, and material conditions for our object of study to become zeitgeisty?
And the object of study we're talking about today is the 3-season comedy series, Reservation Dogs. So for folks who haven't seen the show, and we are doing everything in our power to encourage you to go watch it right now, just pause the episode, just press pause. You can finish this later. Go watch it. So for folks who haven't seen the show, it's a coming-of-age dramatic comedy series about a group of friends who live on the fictional Karrmen Reservation in Oklahoma. The friends, Bear, Cheese, Elora, and Willie Jack, are our 4 main characters, but one of the things I think is really cool about the show is that over the 3 seasons, the adults of Karrmen become increasingly present and important to the series as a whole. So it's not just about teens, but they are the central figures in the show. Reservation Dogs is an ensemble series that is as much about the reservation and community Karrmen as it is about our 4 main protagonists.
So the series was created by Maori filmmaker Taika Waititi of What We Do in the Shadows and Thor Ragnarok fame, and by Seminole and Muskogee filmmaker Sterlin Harjo, who is from Oklahoma, where the series is set. The origin story of Reservation Dogs is that Harjo and Waititi conceived of it on Taika Waititi's kitchen floor, apparently, while they were enjoying late night tea. But Harjo's connection to Oklahoma makes him the driving storyteller of the show. And that's something that Waititi has been clear about. He's described his role as being, quote, the one to push this thing out into the water, and Sterlin was the one who paddled the boat and made sure there weren't any holes in the bottom of it, end quote.
Gosh, it's so interesting that Waititi is needing to talk about like his limited role in the creation of the show and the production of the show. I wonder if it has something to do with his celebrity.
Yeah. I think we might need to talk about celebrity a little bit, but, we'll get to that in a second. One more important piece of production context. The 3 seasons were released between 2021 and 2023 through FX on Hulu, which is a subsidiary of Disney, as is everything in the entire world now. And for people outside of the States, it's streamed on Disney+.
In addition to being phenomenal television in its own right, Reservation Dogs is also a really big deal for Indigenous representation, both on screen and behind the camera. According to the New York Post, it's the first series to use, quote, an entirely Indigenous creative team, end quote, and that includes an all-Native writers' room and main cast. The significance of this is huge. One of the show's producers, Tasba Chavez, who is a citizen of the Bishop Paiute tribe from the Numu, Diné, and San Carlos Apache tribes. Chavez talks about the importance of this show in an interview with the New York Times. Karrmen, would you do us a favor and read this quote from Chavez, please?
Sure. All right. Quote, even 2.5 years ago, to be a Native writer or have any Native characters on any show was a big deal. We went from feeling blessed then to now being on these shows where you have half or full Native writers' rooms, Native directors, full casts of Native actors. There's Indigenous values that are operating within our come up, opening doors and mentoring each other. There's going to be this huge rise of Native artists and creatives because we would never leave each other behind. We just were not in a position of hiring power before, which is where we are now with people like Sterlin, Harjo. End quote.
Perfect. So what I get from that quotation is that this is just the beginning.
And so if we're thinking about how we got to the situation that Chavez is describing in this quote, where you can have an entirely Native cast, an entirely Native writer's room, one of our why nows does, I think, have to be Taika Waititi's celebrity status, as you suggested, Marcelle. So directing Thor Ragnarok, I think, is probably the thing that made him like an unprecedented level of household name, since that was not only a Marvel movie, but one of the biggest and most successful and most critically praised Marvel movies. And that fame arguably lends anything with his name attached to it credibility and legitimacy, right? He's got power in the industry. Hence his metaphor of pushing the Reservation Dogs boat into the water.
Can I jump in and like just talk about that a little bit? Because I have been thinking about that a lot and thinking about how Waititi positions himself relative to other Indigenous filmmakers. And I think Chavez is saying something that I think is fundamentally true, is that there is an ethic and kind of commitment to bringing people in with you and after you. And part of that like reflects the size of the Indigenous media world, which is tiny. It is tiny. Like, I know you're going to go talk about, international Indigenous film festivals, so I'm not going to cut into that. But having gone to those for 10 years and being, somebody who's like just peripherally like in connection with the Indigenous film world, you are 1 degree apart from everybody else, which is both strengthening and, also like cultivates a kind of sense of obligation and responsibility. And so I do think, we, in talking about mainstream film industries, we often talk about these tentpole franchises, right? Like Harry Potter's this tentpole franchise that it's the moneymaker that allows a studio or studios to fund a bunch of smaller productions that they couldn't otherwise create because they're not blockbusters. They're not going to break the bank. I've often thought about Waititi as himself a tentpole. Like he has come into an industry and has used that like rocket, like, updraft of fame to pull in people around him and draw attention to them. People he's worked with, people he knows of, people he's willing to advocate for. And that is, we might see that in some cases in like when we talk about like women or queer film, where it really does take an advocate to open doors for you and take risks on you that aren't actually risks because the quality of that person's work, but somebody, some studio exec is not probably plugged into like the Indigenous film world, for instance, in the same way. So I do often think about Waititi as that kind of tentpole person who has managed to kind of create like an umbrella under which a lot of people are increasingly being able to develop their work.
Yeah. And particularly the strategy of creating a production company, like recognizing, building up enough fame and resources and connections that you can have your own production company and then using that to, fund and foster stuff that that, mainstream media is not going to be finding, noticing, valuing, supporting. I recently interviewed Raquel Gates, who's a scholar of Black cinema, and she was talking about Eddie Murphy as a figure who in the 80s did something really similar, that like he had this unprecedented level of quote unquote crossover celebrity, which is like he was very embedded in the Black comedy world, but also was on SNL and, had been a character in a bunch of like really successful sort of mainstream comedy films, and he used that power and celebrity to start a production company and make films with all Black casts. And it is this sort of like a very tactical way to make use of celebrity when you understand it not as just being about lifting you up as an individual.
Absolutely. Like, honestly, Native people in general, but, navigating mainstream industries and culture, Native people are some of the most incredible strategists. And, I know are also like have been learning from people like Eddie Murphy, like others who have deployed similar models or used similar tactics to intervene in an industry that does not often give them any opportunity at all.
Yeah. So that celebrity piece is really vital, but it's not, I think, the only important context. Karrmen, you pointed to the importance of talking about film festivals, which we will now do. So one of the things that's really interesting about Reservation Dogs is that it is kind of the confluence of a bunch of talent that came together around a certain era of Indigenous cultural programming that sort of fostered like a critical mass of Indigenous writers and producers and directors. There's a really interesting article in The Guardian written by Rade and Simone Palai that points to two important international film festivals that created a lot of opportunities for this current generation of Indigenous creatives. And that is the Indigenous program at the Sundance Film Festival and Toronto's imagineNATIVE Film and Media Arts Festival. Marcelle, you've got a little bit more context about these festivals. And Karrmen, I bet you also know a little bit about these festivals.
Yeah, I can tell you what I learned from some light Googling. So the imagineNATIVE Film and Media Arts Festival launched in the year 2000. And fun fact, is currently planning its 25th anniversary, which is scheduled to take place in June 2025. According to its website, it is currently the largest annual Indigenous media arts event in the world. It presents 18 awards to a short list of 150 projects, and it anticipates approximately 700 submissions. So that's pretty awesome. And the Sundance Film Festival is obviously quite well known. Most listeners will probably have heard of it before. It's well respected. It's an annual film festival put on by the Sundance Institute. My fun fact about this film festival is that the Sundance Institute was founded in 1981 by Robert Redford. According to its website, the Institute's Indigenous program was launched in 1994 and today supports Native and Indigenous storytellers through labs, fellowships, screenings, and gatherings.
Did we miss anything really vital, Karrmen?
I'm so glad you named both festivals, in part because
Rad
one
named
takes place...
both festivals.
Rad.
Yeah.
Thanks, Rad. the imagineNATIVE Film Festival takes place in Toronto every year. And the Sundance Film Festival is in Utah, or the film program largely takes place in the States. And so one thing I've been paying attention to and very mindful of is like that plugs people into sort of two, not separate, but two different kinds of film, cinema, television industries. In their emphasis is going to be different. So I think it's like worth pointing out because, you know, film festivals are all about those international cultural networks and circuits, right? This is what brings like Indigenous filmmakers within 1 degree of one another. Everybody knows one another. This is their professional network. You know, there's this invisible net that is like linking everybody together all over the world. And so these film festivals are really crucial because Indigenous people just don't usually get access to any kind of screen. Like you don't see them in our mainstream theaters, right? We just don't see it. Unless we were watching Jojo Rabbit or What We Do in the Shadows or something like that. And so it's worth pointing out that the national context does matter because it brings proximity to different industries in different ways. So the imagineNATIVE Film Festival is very much being in Canada. We don't have like a studio-based mainstream industry the way that the States does. Like it just didn't grow here like that. We have a more national, provincial, regional kind of model of public funding. So a lot of filmmakers' opportunities that are kind of cultivated in Canada and spoken about and represented at imagineNATIVE, oftentimes, not exclusively, but oftentimes the kinds of programs and like events at imagineNATIVE speak to industry opportunities sort of within Canada.
Yeah, because we've got a lot of cultural funding, right? Like in a way that doesn't necessarily exist in the States. Like we don't have those big studios. We don't make blockbusters. We don't have the same kind of celebrity culture, but like we've got funding you can apply for to make your independent documentary.
Yeah, and somewhere in there, Netflix is contributing some funding, like the streamers are making their inroads. That's another story. But Sundance is much more plugged into the independent film world in the States. So while it's not always, you know, again, the lines are not absolute between like the independent film world and like Hollywood, obviously very permeable boundary, but a lot of Indigenous people who want to make films are leveraging Sundance as a way to kind of make that narrative feature film that is sometimes thought about as kind of the apex of creative production. It's like, what are we all striving for? Narrative feature film. Like, and while that's a false narrative, and like, I actually talk about that a little bit in my book, and I'm not going to like just shamelessly self-promote, but it's worth pointing out like this tendency that there's a narrative that the independent feature film is really at the peak of independent creativity, of realization of creative directorial vision. And so the Sundance Film Festival kind of traffics in that. And so we end up seeing a lot of not a lot, but like those Indigenous independent filmmakers often come up through the Sundance Film Festival.
Yeah. And then the connection, right? That 1 degree of separation means we end up with like that people know each other and have opportunities to collaborate and have connections and know who else is working, and becomes really crucial to this context for Reservation Dogs, in which like there's enough Native actors and writers and directors that you can make 3 seasons of a TV show.
But as an interesting point of fact, Taika Waititi has a foot in both film festivals, well, probably more limbs than that, as having been a part of the Indigenous program at Sundance, as well as a member of the First Embargo Collective at the imagineNATIVE Film Festival, where that brought together a group of Indigenous filmmakers to make short films. So again, the Waititi connection is not inconsiderable.
Yeah, 100%. Okay, so Waititi was obviously like a big part of this show getting made, but is Reservation Dogs like a unicorn? Like, is it sort of an exception to what's happening in TV production right now?
I think we're in the field of unicorns, so I wouldn't step away from, you know, the exceptional like confluence of events that made Reservation Dogs possible and the confluence of talent. But I think we also have to consider something else that was happening at the same time, which is Rutherford Falls came out on Peacock, which is NBC's streaming service, in 2021 as well. The showrunner for that is Sierra Teller Ornelas, who is Navajo or Diné, but also Mike Schur and Ed Helms helped create that series as well. And then in 2022, Dark Winds came out on AMC and AMC Plus. Now, Dark Winds is a drama, a straight up kind of Western drama vibe. It's based on a set of novels by a non-Indigenous man who sort of positioned himself as living like in Oklahoma in very like close proximity to Indigenous people. And so, you know, his books are kind of talked about, are thrillers or mysteries that are kind of talked about because for their time were pretty interesting, that they talked with a lot of nuance about Indigenous folks and recognized that they don't all look the same. They don't all use the same language, you know. But that was also created and helmed by an Indigenous showrunner and developer. That is remarkable and exceptional.
So I hear you, Karrmen, about being in a field of unicorns, but somebody let those unicorns in that field. So can you like talk a little bit about like what might have been happening like politically or culturally that, you know, who opened up the
Who
field?
let the unicorns out? Woof, 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 woof.
Yes.
As the song famously goes.
I mean, there obviously, when you're asking an academic for context, we can go dig deep and talk long. So I'm just going to point to a few things that are worth identifying. So very broadly speaking, the 2010s were a time of almost unprecedented visibility of Indigenous political organizing that was covered extensively by like traditional news outlets, but also social media became a major circuit for these movements. So I, you know, as somebody Indigenous from Canada, you know, we have to talk about Idle No More.
Totally.
A grassroots movement that came out in Canada. It began roughly 2012, and it was largely in protest to an omnibus legislation that would remove a lot of Indigenous rights around traditional territories where a lot of corporations wanted to set up oil drilling and like especially the Enbridge Northern Gateway pipeline. That movement mobilized social media to gain visibility and traction nationally and internationally. Some of you may remember the flash mob round dances that were happening in malls all across Canada that were being recorded or streamed live. So that was huge. We also in Canada, actually, this is worldwide as well, the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Crisis. You know, we have to mention it because Canada set up a formal inquiry in 2016 after decades of pressure from Indigenous advocacy groups, communities, NGOs, pressuring Canada to investigate the disproportionate violence and murders of Indigenous women in Canada, which is like up in the thousands. Certainly, I think at this point, they have documented at least 1,000 murdered Indigenous women, and the numbers are a lot higher. This catalyzed, you know, a lot of recognition across North America and in Australia and New Zealand, Aotearoa, where these disproportionate numbers are also experienced. So that was after decades of work that happened in 2016. And third, and by far not least, the Dakota Access Pipeline protests in 2016 and 2017, which was this mammoth international Indigenous-led mobilization against the Dakota Access Pipeline that was a $3.7 billion project that would carry crude oil from North Dakota to a refinery in Chicago. The Standing Rock Sioux tribe identified that it cut through sacred territory and it could contaminate their water supply, which was from the Missouri River. That was less than a mile from the reservation. There was no meaningful consultation done with these tribes. The communities and their allies set up a protest camp in Cannonball, North Dakota. And some estimates said that the numbers swelled in that camp to over 10,000 people.
That's incredible.
Which is the largest.
I remember like conversations around Standing Rock in part being like, okay, guys, actually don't come unless you are going to bring something useful. Because actually there are too many people coming and you're using up all our resources. So
yeah, it was massive. And when was the last time an Indigenous mobilization of those numbers happened? Like,
yeah.
I don't think it's ever happened in recent time to that scale. And this whole campaign sort of came together in no small part to their hashtag, no DAPL. And in fact, the movement became known by that. So that was 2016, 2017. This is immediately preceding the emergence of these 3 series,
right,
controlled by Indigenous creatives. So I think we have to think about those series in context of a major shift in the visibility of Indigenous people, Indigenous issues, but also just the range and scope of like what contemporary Indigenous people look like and sound like and speak like. So it really was this incredible cultural moment. And I think we have to think about it as feeding into why the streamers would see it as a real reason to start engaging with Indigenous people in much more contemporary contexts.
Thank you. That's so helpful.
You know, that makes me think about the complex relationship between like recognizing that for-profit companies are taking advantage of your visibility in a politicized moment and like knowing that that is ultimately a sort of capitalist goal, but still taking advantage of those opportunities and doing something really interesting with them. And I think that theoretical framework for understanding how Indigenous creators like navigate these systems in a way that takes up the resources without capitulating to the logics of the industries would be really helpful for us at this moment. Do you know anybody who has written a book about that?
I kind of have.
Cool. Let's talk about it.
And I will say, I didn't start the fire, but I have a huge debt to some thinkers who came before me to help me conceptualize how Indigenous people navigate the constraints of settler colonial systems and institutions in order to do their work. So with that caveat, like, happy to talk about the book wherever you want to start.
Great.
Awesome. Well, in the previous segment, I was promised theory. And Hannah, I would like to gently recommend that we now move into the theory we need, a segment where we introduce exactly that critical theory to help us make sense of this marvelous topic.
And lucky for us, we have a theorist here to help us unpack the core concept I want to engage with today, which comes straight from your book, Karrmen. Specifically, I want to talk about the idea of producing sovereignty. So the relationship between sovereignty and production, and about the theoretical underpinnings of those two concepts, sovereignty and production. So I'm going to say, let's start with sovereignty, shall we?
Sure. I mean, please go ahead and give this a finer needle.
Specifically, I would like to know, I mean, I know I read your book. Specifically, I would like you to speak a little bit more about what Indigenous sovereignty means politically, and then what it means in the context of cultural production, which are intertwined but not identical.
Yeah, they share a lot in common. And in the book, I go into how their politics in like the legal political realm and then the cultural politics of that actually parallel one another. Like they're pretty commensurate. So Indigenous sovereignty, it doesn't have a single definition, right? It doesn't have a single definition nor a single kind of form of what it looks like or how it plays out. It's a principle that is based upon Indigenous people's pre-existing rights to self-determination, and that those rights have not been extinguished with the advance of colonization or the establishment of settler nation states. So Eileen Moreton Robinson clarifies, like, when we're talking about Indigenous sovereignty, we are not talking about something that looks like sovereignty the way it's conceptualized in like Western nations, which are sort of tied to a nation state that has bounded territory, right? Boundaries borders and
For more on the history of the nation state, refer to
oh my God.
Which Please, our episode on the nation state.
Benedict Anderson. Like we can give you a reading list of how we talk about nation states, but there's also a singular unified authority, the government of, and individual rights, kind of conceptualized as individual rights within that. We aren't talking about that when we talk about Indigenous sovereignty. We're talking about the right to self-determination. We're talking about unextinguished rights and title to territories, traditional use of territories, which again is not typically or always has clear borders. We're talking about nomadic people who share territory, traditional agreements around territory sharing and resource sharing. So these are really complex, sophisticated relationships that existed prior to colonization and have continued to exist after it. So when we're talking about Indigenous sovereignty, yes, self-governance is a part of it, right? But we can't think about Indigenous sovereignty limited to how we govern ourselves, because that's just management, right? It's like, oh, let's like manage one another. Like, no, like a municipality. We're not talking about that. It is laws and an understanding of a people and how they relate to one another and to others, human and non-human. And I'll say epistemological roots of the ways that those relationships have emerged and are understood and practiced. I'm talking about like Indigenous worldviews are the roots of the political and legal, right? Like we're not just isolating sovereignty to the autonomous exercise of governing ourselves or of our laws. It's not like those are forms. We're talking about principles. These principles derive from worldviews that pre-exist settler colonialism, Western Euro-American thought. And it is from these traditional forms of knowledge that how we are to be in the world and to one another, how those are shaped, how we derive knowledge from the world. And when we're talking about, how the frameworks for how we understand that we relate to one another, to others, and how we maintain those relationships, we're talking about laws. Those are laws, right? So in Canada, the Indigenous sovereignty movement as a political movement began after World War II and picked up steam through the civil rights movement and really grew into fruition through the 70s, 80s, 90s. So that's the immediate preceding historical context for the period that my book talks about. But what it was that despite having treaties, like many Indigenous nations having treaties with the Canadian state, despite that relationship being formalized in Canadian law. So we're talking about the Indian Act and also the Canadian Constitution, which acknowledges and recognizes Aboriginal rights and title, like that's the language of it in the Constitution. We're seeing like decades of the Canadian state not upholding its part of those laws. So the Indigenous sovereignty movement was really about also insisting Indigenous nations coming together to insist upon like that hold Canada accountable, but also holds them to the recognition. It's like, we are not a special interest group. We are not like minority using the language of the state. We are nations and we have nation to nation relationships with you. And you have to treat us like that. That is your job.
So you're speaking right now about sort of sovereignty as a general concept, but we can also talk about Indigenous sovereignty like as a particular political movement, right?
Yeah, there absolutely is. There's more than one. We can talk about a worldwide Indigenous sovereignty movements arising in countries worldwide. For the purposes of this conversation, I'm just referring directly to the one that came up in Canada post-war.
So we've talked about sovereignty as like almost like an ethic, connected to worldviews. We've talked about it as a particular set of political movements. How does sovereignty over cultural production tie into this context?
It's really interesting in that it's actually like pretty consistent politically with the political and legal realm. Within cultural production, sovereignty or self-determination may be a way of framing it. It often refers to the right of Indigenous people to represent themselves in a way that they determine is meaningful to them. So you can sort of hear the echoes in the political realm of that, like, nation-to-nation recognition requires that, the oppressor nation or the settler colonial state recognize that Indigenous people have a right to determine how they want to realize or how they want to participate or grow a particular area of cultural production. And that has to come from be determined, discussed, debated, and ultimately realized with Indigenous people doing that work. So not people on behalf of Indigenous people, but Indigenous people actually doing that. So within the creative and culture industries, if I'm referring to Canada specifically, and I probably should, because people will have their own understandings of other national and international contexts. But in Canada, what it looked like was a lot of Indigenous artists and advocates arguing that Indigenous people should have access to creative and cultural industries and institutions as a part of Canada meeting its obligation to Native people. The argument would be that they have an obligation to set aside resources, programs to allow Indigenous people to develop the skills, training, expertise in creative areas and toward them govern, like, in a sense, like creating the opportunity for themselves and for people coming up behind them to create their own work. So what I'm kind of saying here is that I'm not saying that would be a separate culture and creative industry for Indigenous people, but that Indigenous people would have access to the resources, programs, funding that already exists in institutions, in addition to funds and resources deliberately set aside for their use in order to develop their own representation in these institutions and, in this case, on screens, film and television, in a way that they have determined fits.
So this is a leading question. I love to ask a leading question. Is there maybe a concept that you could introduce us to that helps us to understand a little bit the importance and a way of theorizing and thinking about Indigenous cultural production, particularly when it comes to, say, visual representation?
Yeah, as a point of departure, well, first it was an entry point, and then kind of something that, an area of thought that I kind of grew in the book was largely taken from Michelle Raheja's book, Reservation Realism, where she theorizes a concept of visual sovereignty in not just Indigenous production, but how Indigenous people engage with self-representation. So what I mean by that is that, well, a couple things. One, the concept of visual sovereignty has been theorized by different people in different ways. So I'm specifically talking about Raheja's framework. And in her book, really, she's confronting that there's a tendency to kind of start histories of Indigenous cinema or media or television where there is a clear and identifiable Indigenous control of the means of production, right? They're a director, there's the producer, they're the showrunner, writer, they're in control of the production. They're sort of above the line, kind of like within the mainstream, like kind of language, they'd be thought of as like creative control. She's reframing how we're understanding sovereignty to think about the way that Indigenous people exert control over the ways that they are represented. And if we think about it that way, then she's saying we have to go back way further in film and television history and look at how Indigenous performers in like mainstream productions exerted pressure and influence over how they were represented, how other Indigenous people are represented. So actors who performed against stereotype, right? Because we're talking about an industry that traffics in Indigenous stereotypes. So she's looking at how did they put pressure against that form of representation? What about the people who negotiated with the director about how a scene should be looked or performed? Or the role of like Indigenous cultural consultants? Like, what is their role in putting pressure on conventional representation. And what she's not saying is like that was a solution to the problem of representation. She's just saying that there's a kind of labor being done there that if we start certain histories at a certain point, we're covering over the labor that has been done by all of these Indigenous folks who've worked within mainstream industries and worked on the language of representation, worked on the way that production operates, works on who's on set when, kind of like putting pressure on this system and industry. And I found that really valuable.
So I guess to sort of use Reservation Dogs as an example, like the history of Indigenous television doesn't start with Reservation Dogs, right? So that would be an inaccurate representation of the history of Indigenous television. She's saying that we have to go back further and look at the ways that actors would have ensured their representation looked a particular way or represented community in a certain way.
Yeah, I think she's like, this is not to say that, I think what a lot of cultural commentators are saying right now is like, yeah, this is the first time we have seen Indigenous people have this level of creative control over production. And like, that is no small feat. That is massive. That is exceptional. But I feel like what Raheja would point us to is that those series wouldn't have been possible if Indigenous people weren't getting the training, expertise, experience in all areas of the industry and gathering that together. It could be invisible labor, right? They might be a grip. They might be working in makeup. They might be costume. They might be the camera person. And it took that confluence of events to bring those people and that talent together and make these series happen. So they didn't just come out of nowhere. They're the outcome of decades of like often invisible labor by Indigenous people we recognize some of these actors because some of them were in front of the camera. Some of them were like named, but a lot of them weren't. She's not saying that Indigenous people wholesale within those roles transformed the industry and made all this space and room, but that these people, like when the conditions were right, were able to come together and make something that is on par with the highest level of prestige television that we've ever seen.
Okay, Karrmen. So what I hear you saying is that it's not just about on-screen talent. There's so much that goes into the production of these kinds of shows and media representation. Do you want to talk a little bit about, say, production studies and how you've drawn from it in your own analysis of Indigenous media?
In the case of my book, one of my main arguments is that Indigenous media creatives are navigating media producing institutions, like their production conventions, their workplace cultures, their formats, like the National Film Board of Canada, it's documentary, right? So they have these constraints that they're having to navigate. And what I'm arguing is that they are taking up and testing these conventions and representational formats and their visual language, and they're adapting them to make them meaningful for Indigenous people and Indigenous priorities. So that act of testing, reflecting, it is a form of critical production. A critique is embedded within their work in the way that they are transforming the style, they're transforming the visual language. That's a critical language. So I developed that understanding as a framework for analyzing what I'm watching on screen that Indigenous artists are creating. I'm looking for what are those transformations that they're enacting? Why are they transforming them in particular ways to make them meaningful for Native people? So that's the kind of novel, like analytical framework that I'm theorizing in the book. But studies of production culture point to the fact that the creative work of what ends up on screen, it doesn't just come from the director, the writer, the producer. It's like the people on the set also are making sense of their own labor. And they do that both on set and off set. right? Like when you're being trained, that's a form of making sense of how do you light a scene? How do you shoot a scene? How do you record a scene? There's also industry activities like festivals, like promotion and publicity materials that articulate how people make sense of an industry or an institution. So I looked to those materials, like how is this institution or industry understanding itself? Like what are its values, its beliefs?
And then how can you use that to like understand what's being subverted? Like you've got to have that sort of insight.
Yeah, it's a baseline for setting like how is this institution understanding itself in order to triangulate like, okay, how are Indigenous people understanding that institution? And like then how does that show up in the work?
Okay, this is such helpful theoretical framework, Karrmen, and I am just champing at the bit to tie it back to Reservation Dogs. So I know that it is uncouth for me to prompt my own thesis, but are you okay if I offer you both a thesis now?
Absolutely.
I want to hear it. In our final segment, in this essay I Will, Hannah will bring together the material conditions of our objective study and the theoretical framework that we've just discussed in order to articulate a thesis statement that we can then use to think and imagine and interrogate a little bit more the cultural importance of Reservation Dogs.
All right, here we go. In the 6th episode of Reservation Dogs, Willie Jack and her father, Leon, go hunting on land that both is and is not theirs. Is because it's Muskogee Nation territory, but isn't because it was bought by some Texan ranchers who, Leon makes clear, are not planning to give it back. When Willie Jack tells Leon she got a photo of a huge buck that she has nicknamed Chunk off one of the trail cams, Leon insists they go looking for the cameras, concerned that their presence means the Texan ranchers are monitoring the area where he's been hunting for years. When they finally spot a camera, Leon says he wants one of them for Father's Day, and Willie Jack responds by immediately trying to pry it off the tree to give it to him. In this moment, Willie Jack and her father are literally seizing the means of production by taking control of the cameras that are being used to surveil them and to position them as trespassers on their own territory. I read this episode as a kind of artist statement for Reservation Dogs as a whole, which as a series is characterized not by Indigenous representation alone, but by what scholar Karrmen Crey might call production sovereignty, or, quote, the transformation that Indigenous media practitioners create while working within dominant systems and institutions, end quote. Crey reminds us to consider not only what's taking place in front of the camera, but also who's behind the camera and how they got there. Reservation Dogs is not an outlier or fully a unicorn, but the culmination of a new generation of Indigenous writers, directors, producers, and actors who have strategically navigated and transformed the landscape of media production to make a show like this possible. In this essay, I
really want to talk about William Knifeman. Can we talk about the unknown warrior? Can we talk about the absolute genius of taking like white stereotypes of Indigenous people and flipping them on their head? There's so much I want to talk about.
Will you give listeners who haven't watched the show yet some context about our spirit warrior? I love him so much.
Karrmen, how would you describe Knifeman? Because I'm looking at him as a flipped white representation of an Indigenous warrior.
Yeah, he's played by Dallas Goldtooth, who is one of the 1491s. And for those who don't know, the 1491s are like an Indigenous comedy troupe, and Sterlin Harjo was a part of it. So you see, you see these same folks come in and out and play characters in the background or foreground. But William Knifeman was a warrior when he was alive who was at the Battle of Little Bighorn, and his horse tripped in a gopher hole, I think, and he died before he...
It was a gopher hole.
It was a gopher hole.
Horse rolled over onto him and he died.
And he died before even getting to the battle. So now he's a spirit who shows up to bear and kind of is a little bit like of welcome and unwelcome company, depending on what bear is going through. He's, of course, like, I think like you're saying, Marcelle, there's a way that he plays against a type of like the Indian spirit, like like, and he knowingly like plays that character, like he knows, like he's like looks like it in a particular way to kind of undo the coding. But somebody said something amazing actually about him that made me realize there's this like other facet to him as well, which is it was Ho-Chunk comic artist Jim Terry. I was just at a talk he was giving, and he just threw concept after concept on the table. That was amazing. But he talked about the fact that Native people are really accustomed to the casual supernatural. It's just everyday around, and that he was saying that Native people know this is true, like that supernatural surrounds us, and so have ways of dealing with it. But for non-Native people who don't have that recognition, who aren't aware of the casual supernatural, that might be read as like horrifying, terrifying, like awe-inspiring. Like they might have, there's film genres for that, right? He's like, so white people might be, this is a horror movie for them to have a ghost suddenly appear or a spirit appear. But for Native people, it's a part of the everyday, and they have ways of dealing with it. And so I was like, that's exactly how I feel about William Knifeman. It's like, he's the casual supernatural. He's a part of all of those spirits that are just with them. And so it's not always the most frightening, alarming, terrifying, traumatizing thing when they show up. Yeah, they can come out of nowhere and surprise you, or like be annoying and like follow you around buzzing in your ear. But like it's not a horror movie. It's just what is around you in your day-to-day life.
Yeah, I made a really similar note when I was watching the show yesterday. And I had to look up the term that I think Daniel Heath Justice coined in Why Indigenous Literatures Matter. He's writing about why the concept of magical realism doesn't make sense when talking about Indigenous literatures, both because it's based in a totally different sort of literary history, but also because it presupposes a division between magic and realism. And so the term that he uses is wonderworks, but it's like the idea of realist Indigenous literature, film, television includes things that would, for a Western audience, be perceived as supernatural because that division isn't relevant in the same way.
Yeah, absolutely. I think people have the different terms for understanding it. And like, I think we're talking about the same thing. And like, look at the way that William Knifeman is like, in a sense, almost operates like bureaucratically. He's like, why are you here? You know, like Bear might ask him, why are you here? And he's like, oh yeah, I just have some work to do. I got to take that spirit, get them on the train. Yeah. It's like, that is workaday stuff. Like, this is his job. He's like literally saying, this is my job. This is what I do during the day.
There's a point where I think Bear is really frustrated that he won't give him more useful or straightforward advice. And William Knifeman says to him, like, I know I don't like it either, but I'm just doing my job, basically. Like, these are the rules. I don't make them.
Listen, I don't make the rules. This is just what being a spirit is.
Yeah.
Like, that's beautiful.
I also think it's significant that William Knifeman is not the only supernatural figure in the show.
Yeah.
Right? That like, even if he was sort of this one-off, it would suggest a sort of something anomalous about him or anomalous about Bear. But William Knifeman like starts showing up for other characters, for one thing, which is a very interesting way of like undermining any reading a viewer might have of being like, oh, maybe this is just in Bear's head. It's like, no, absolutely not. That's not a legitimate reading of what's happening here. But we also get introduced to some other supernatural figures, including my personal favorite, the Deer Lady, who is a sexy woman with the legs of a deer who murders men. I love her.
And it's also not always clear when one of our characters is talking to someone else if that person is a spirit or not. Like, there's a scene when Willie Jack is talking to an older man in the waiting room before she's going to talk to her aunt in prison. And we don't know in that scene that he's a spirit, but we learn very casually that he is actually a spirit.
Which is like a visual refusal of hard lines between the realist and the supernatural.
Yeah.
Like, I don't want to speculate, but like not many non-Indigenous folks would have the kind of grasp of the casual supernatural or like wonder works to know how to represent a figure like William Knifeman. The fact of all of those ways that the boundary between like the spiritual and reality break down is more reflective of the lived reality of Indigenous people. And it takes the Indigenous people who were on the set, who were all contributing to building those scenes and creating them, and not romanticizing or creating a like really like spiritual, frightening or like ethereal spiritual moment with him, but like grounding him in reality and like humor and like body humor, like using that to make him a part of reality. I think like the difference there is the people who are creating that representation, the fact that Indigenous folks are in control of how that scene plays out is really what matters here, and why Indigenous people need to be in control of those sets. I was at a panel with Sterlin, Harjo, and some of the actors, and they were talking about the set. And they're like, they've worked on mainstream sets. Of course they have. They're native actors. So they got plugged into a bunch of mainstream productions, non-Indigenous crew. They're like, it's extremely hierarchical. Train on time, you know, like bullying, like that kind of like structure. And then they said they would walk on to the set for Reservation Dogs. And it was like going to a family barbecue. Like everybody was just like, hey, like, welcome, or like everybody knew one another. And could be that way, and they could still get that show to happen, you know, like it didn't have to be the way it was. So part of me is like, why production cultures matter is that not only can you get like the work like that out of a completely different set that does not require the hierarchy, the misogyny, but also that studies of production culture like point to the people who are like off camera and the changes that they can instigate, and kind of like just by virtue of being there and being with one another, cultivate a different kind of production culture that is actually like supportive and nurturing, but is also, you know, that itself makes its way onto the screen. Like we can see the kind of nuance and subtlety.
So there are scenes that have owls and the owl's eyes are blurred out. Is this part of what you're talking about with the sort of the visual language of the show being like specific to the Indigenous creators?
Yeah, I noticed that in the scene where they go and meet Uncle Brownie for the first time, that there's an owl figure hanging from his porch. They've pixelated the owl's eyes in exactly the same way they later pixelate Uncle Brownie's penis. And I didn't understand what was happening there.
So one way of understanding those moments, and, you know, I'm not Muskogee, I'm not Seminole, so I am heavily abbreviating what I'm about to say, but having spoken about this series with some other folks who said, well, the blurring of the eyes of the owl was there to protect the audience from the owls, because typically owl eyes have a real negative cut in like Muskogee culture within Oklahoma more broadly, that they could be like harbingers of something negative. And so you're not supposed to look them in the eye. So we could think about like them blurring out the eyes, especially for those who don't know what the owl's eyes means. It's a way of protecting you, protecting the audience from an unintentional exposure to something that might bring them harm. So there, you know, again, like, a lot of people, I think, especially online, have questions about it. I still have questions about it. I'm no expert culturally on the like potential risks of looking at owl eyes, so I'm qualifying what I'm saying that way. But it's something that Indigenous folks kind of have this special knowledge of, and like want to ensure that people who don't know and people who do know are protected from a sudden shot of owl eyes on screen. So it's a form of care.
Oh, that's such a beautiful explanation, Karrmen. And, you know, considering what you were describing about the production culture behind the scenes of the show and how that culture itself is such a culture of care, it just seems to reflect back so much what the show is ostensibly about, which is about community and about caring for one another. And I just think the way these things weave together is just really phenomenal. Material Girls is a Witch Please production and is distributed by Acast. Why not take a break from committing small-time heists and visit ohwitchplease.ca to check out the rest of our episodes and access our transcripts and reading lists. And heck, if you happen to buy some merch while you're there with your small-time heist money, we won't complain. On our website, you can also learn more about our other two shows, Gender Playground, a podcast about the joys of gender-affirming care for kids, and Making Worlds, a video podcast about sci-fi, fantasy, and the radical power of imagining otherwise. Again, you can find out about all of our shows at ohwitchplease.ca.
We have an excellent newsletter at ohwitchplease.substack.com and an even better Patreon at patreon.com/ohwitchplease. We are also on Instagram, X, and Threads at ohwitchplease and on TikTok at ohwitchpleasepod. Karrmen, if people want to find out more about your work or buy your cool book, where can they find you?
I believe you can find my book at the University of Minnesota Press website, Producing Sovereignty, The Rise of Indigenous Media in Canada. And I am terrible on social media, so I'm so sorry I can't offer you plugs for those.
No, this is you've made good life choices.
Yes, it's true.
Thanks to Auto Syndicate for the use of our theme song, Shopping Mall, and of course, thanks to the whole Witch Please Productions team, our digital content coordinator, Gabby Iori, our social media manager and marketing designer, Zoe Mix, our sound engineer, Malika Gumpankum, our transcriber, Ruth Ormiston, and our executive producer, Hannah Rehack, a.k.a. Coach.
At the end of every episode, we will thank everyone who has joined our Patreon or boosted their tier to help make our work possible. Patreon support is the way we pay our incredible team, so when we say thank you, we really, really mean it. You make the show possible. Our enormous gratitude goes out to Nicole, Renee M., Kate P., Pamela F., Hannah L., Joe S., Claire, Haley Y., Aaron T., Amy J., Kristen W., Sarah C., Ash, Anthea, Zoe C., and Yanni.
We'll be back next episode to tackle a whole new piece of pop culture through a possibly new theoretical lens. But until then...
Later, decolonizators.
I want